They brought it to me in a feed crate, the kind we used for hauling protein bricks up from the supply caves, and the corporal who carried it held the thing at arm's length the whole way across the yard like it might decide to be alive again. It was raining that night. It rained most nights on the Sellet line, a thin warm rain that smelled of iron and rotted moss, and the water ran off the crate in pink threads where the blood had pooled in the bottom. He set it down on my triage table without a word and stepped back, and I looked at what they'd given me, and for a long moment I did not understand what I was looking at. I had been a medic for 11 years by then, 9 of them on worlds with names you've never heard, 2 of them on Vahn, on the line, in a prefabricated aid station we called the Cut because that was what it was, a slot dug into the side of a ridge with a roof bolted over it and the mud bleeding in at the seams. I had pulled men out of vehicles that were still burning. I had held the ends of people who were never going to be whole again and told them they would be fine, because that is part of the job too, the lying, and I had learned to do it with a steady face. I thought there was nothing left in the universe that could make my hand stop. I was wrong about that, the way you are wrong about most things until the thing arrives and corrects you. You have to understand what it was to hold a line against the Vahn because the rest of this does not land otherwise. We did not lose ground to them in great battles. There were no great battles. There was the line and there was the dark below it, and every few nights the dark would begin to glow, and some number of men who had been alive at dusk would not be alive at dawn, and the line would have moved up the ridge a meter or two, and that was the war. They were patient the way weather is patient. They did not need the ground we held. They simply intended to be standing on it eventually, and they were content to wait out every human who would ever try to stop them. We had pushed a relief column down to the second wire the spring before, 40 men under a captain named Vahn who had been decent to me, and the Vahn had let half of it through before they closed the dark behind it like a hand, and we found what we found 3 days later when the lights finally let us go down and look. I had processed most of those men. I had a sample bag in my kit that was the right size for a hand and the right size also for the things that were not hands. So when I say I knew what the Vahn were, I am not speaking from briefings. I am speaking from the work. What was in the crate was a Vahn, a young one, a pup, though we did not have a proper word for it then, and I am only using that word now because it is the one that comes closest to the truth of what it was. It was no larger than a hunting dog, 4-limbed and long in the spine, its hide the gray-green of old bruises, and where a dog would have had a snout it had instead a blunt wedge of a head split by a mouth that opened in 4 directions instead of 1. Down the front of its throat ran a seam of skin that should have been glowing. On a healthy Vahn that seam burned a low steady amber, the light by which they spoke to each other across the dark, the light our men had learned to hate more than anything else in the war because it was the last thing a lot of them ever saw. This one's throat was dark. It had been dark for some time. It was not breathing right. Found it in the wreck of a skiff we put down past the 3rd wire, the corporal said. Research wants it. Major Halloran wants it on a transport to the rear by morning, intact as you can manage. They want to take it apart and see how the lights work. He looked at it, and then he looked at me, and his face did a complicated thing. Keep it alive that long, Doc, that's all, just till the transport. I want to be honest about the moment because everything else came out of it, and I have had a long time since to be honest about very little else. When I looked at that animal dying on my table, the war did not enter into it. I knew what the Vahn were. I had seen what they did. I had spent 2 years on a line that they were slowly, patiently grinding to nothing, and I had buried friends in pieces small enough to fit in a sample bag, and not one of those friends had been granted a clean death by the things that killed them, because the Vahn did not do clean and they did not do mercy. Those were human inventions and the Vahn had no use for them. I knew all of that, and none of it was in the room with me. What was in the room was a creature that could not breathe, and a pair of hands that knew how to make a thing breathe. And the distance between those 2 facts was the only distance I have ever found impossible to leave alone. So I took it out of the crate. I am not going to pretend I knew what I was doing. There were no xenomedical references for a live Vahn because nobody had ever kept one alive long enough to write them. What I had was a body in front of me and 11 years of reading bodies, and a body tells you most of what you need to know if you are willing to be quiet and listen to it. Its chest, if you can call it that, moved in a shallow flutter, far too fast, the way a thing breathes when it is breathing around something. I ran my fingers down the long muscle of its side and felt the wrongness there, a hard, displaced shape under the skin where a rib equivalent had been driven inward by the crash. Punctured the air sac. I did not know they had air sacs. I learned it that night with my hands, the way I have learned most of the true things in my life. I worked on it until the rain stopped and the gray came up over the ridge. I had to improvise everything. I cut into it with a scalpel meant for human skin, and found the skin was tougher, more like hide, and I had to lean my whole weight into the blade. I drained the air sac with a chest needle and a length of tubing, and a one-way valve I rigged from a glove. When the displaced rib thing kept folding back and I packed the cavity and braced it with a splint bent from a ration tin lid. The animal did not fight me. That was the thing I could not stop thinking about later. It should have fought me. It was a predator, an apex thing, and I had my hands inside it, and it lay still under me and watched me with one flat black eye and did not so much as snap. I told myself it was too weak to fight. I think now it was something else. I think it had simply never in its short life been touched by anything that did not intend to kill it, and it did not have the category for what I was doing, and so it waited to find out. I talked to it while I worked. I do not know why. I had talked to the dying men the same way, the lying patter you keep up so a frightened thing has a human voice to hold onto in the bad dark. Easy now, easy, I've got you, you're all right. None of it true and all of it the truth that matters in the moment. I said those same words to a Vahn pup with my hands buried to the wrist in the cavity of its side, and the flat black eye tracked my face while I said them, and the seam of its throat would brighten a fraction whenever my voice changed, dimming when I went quiet to concentrate, brightening again when I spoke. It was reading me, not the words. It had no words. It was reading the rhythm of the thing under the words, the part of a voice that says you are not alone and I am not going to leave. And I understood without quite letting myself understand it that no human voice had ever said that to a Vahn before, because no Vahn had ever been in a position to need it said, because a fallen Vahn was a gone Vahn, and the gone do not get talked to. I was doing two impossible things at once and I only noticed the first one. I was mending it. I did not yet see that I was also speaking to it, in the only language either of us had, and that the speaking would turn out to be the larger of the two. Toward dawn the seam down its throat flickered, just once, a dull pulse of amber there and gone, like a coal stirred under ash. Its breathing eased. The flutter slowed and deepened into something I recognized, the long, patient rhythm of a body that has decided for now to keep going. I sat back on the floor of the cut with my hands red to the wrist, and I looked at the thing I had saved. And I started laughing, very quietly, in the way you do when you are too tired to do anything else, and the only alternative is the other thing. That was the night I lost my job. I just didn't know it yet. Out here the bill for a thing like that always comes later, and it always comes for more than you spent. The transport came at midday, and I would not let them take it. I have gone over that conversation in my head more times than I can count, and I cannot tell you why I did it. Except that by midday the animal was awake and standing on legs that did not want to hold it, and it had drunk water from my hand, and a thing that has drunk water from your hand is no longer a sample. Halloran's people came with their padded case and their cold store and their forms, and I stood in the doorway of my own aid station, and told them the patient was not stable for transport, which was true. It was also the kind of true that everyone in that yard understood to be a different kind of true entirely. Halloran came himself in the end. He was not a cruel man. I want that on the record because it would be easier to tell this if he had been. He was a tired man with a hard job, holding a line that everyone above him had quietly decided was already lost, and he had been told that the lights in the Vahn's throats were how they coordinated their packs, and that if research could understand the lights, then maybe we could blind them, jam them, turn the dark back into just the dark instead of a thing that hunted in formation. A weapon, in other words, a way to stop the dying. He believed that, and he was probably right, and I stood in his way over an animal. "You understand what these things are," he said. He did not raise his voice. "You've seen the line, you of all people." "I've seen the line," I said. "Then you know one of those got loose on a transport, killed 3 of my men last spring before they put it down. You know what they did to the relief column at the second wire. You've sewn up what's left of them, and you're telling me you won't hand over one half-grown specimen that might be the thing that ends it." "I'm telling you it's my patient," I said. "It came through that door breathing. It's not going out of it in a cold store. That's all I've got, Major. It's not a position. It's just the only thing I know how to be." He looked at me for a while. Behind me, in the dark of the cut, the animal made a low sound I had not heard before, a sort of 3-note clicking down in its chest, and the seam of its throat lit and held, amber and steady, the way a healthy one's would. I did not get the chance to find out what Halloran would have decided, because that was when the second wire fell. The Vahn came in the afternoon, which they almost never did, and they came in numbers we had not seen on that line in a year. They poured out of the tree line below the third wire in a flood, and they moved the way they always moved, which was the thing that broke men more than the killing, that liquid coordinated certainty, dozens of bodies acting as one body, the throat lights flaring and answering and flaring across the whole front in patterns we had never been able to read. The forward positions did not hold. They did not even slow it. I have heard the sound of that line going under, and I have never found words for it, and I am not going to try here, except to say that for an hour the war was not a thing happening at a distance. It was in the yard. It was at the door of the cut. I will not describe the killing in detail, partly because the audience for this does not need it, and partly because the truth is that the killing was almost the smaller part of it. The Vahn did not rage. That was the thing that hollowed men out. There was no fury in it to brace against, no shouting, no enemy you could hate in the moment because hate needs a face that hates you back. They came through the wire with the lights flaring in those long, unreadable patterns, and they did their work with the cold efficiency of a tide coming up a beach, and the only sound was ours, the rifles and the orders and the screaming, our noise pouring into their silence and the silence swallowing all of it. I have heard veterans of older wars say the worst thing was the noise. For us, it was the quiet. You would look up from a man you were losing and see one of them, 10 feet off, regarding you with that flat black eye while it worked, neither hurrying nor cruel, and you understood that to the thing in front of you, you were not an enemy. You were not even prey, quite. You were weather, in the way they were weather to us, an inconvenience of the ground they intended to be standing on, and there is a particular cold that comes into a man when he learns he is not even worth being hated by the thing that is killing him. I did what a medic does. I worked. They brought me men with their throats opened, and their bellies opened, and the specific terrible wounds the Vahn made with the bone hooks on their forelimbs, wounds I had a whole private vocabulary for, and I sorted them into the ones I could save, and the ones I could only make comfortable, and I lied to the comfortable ones with a steady face, and the animal I had saved sat in the corner of my aid station the entire time and watched me work on its own kind's victims and made no sound at all. There was a lull near the end of the first hour, the way there sometimes is, the lights pulling back a little to reform, and in that lull Akaffer came to the door of the cut to see if I was still standing. He had been on the line longer than any of us, longer than Halloran, long enough that the younger men treated him as a kind of fixed feature of the world, like the ridge. He had taught me which of the local lichens you could boil down for fever and which would stop your heart inside an hour. He had a daughter on a rear world he had not seen in 3 years, and he kept her drawings in the chest pocket over his heart, flattened and soft from handling, and once, on a quiet night, He had shown them to me one by one with a tenderness that did not fit the size of his hands. One of them was a yellow sun with a smiling face, and the word Dad under it in a child's careful block letters. He looked past me into the dark of the cut and saw the animal sitting in the corner with its throat lit, watching us, and he did not say anything about it. He just looked at it a long moment, and then at me, and something moved behind his face that I did not have time to ask about, because the lights came up again at the wire and he went back out into them. The next time I saw him, he was on a stretcher. Sergeant Acaffer died on my table in the second hour. The bone hook had gone in under his arm and there was nothing under there left to fix, and he knew it before I did, the way they so often do. He grabbed my wrist with the last of his grip, and he did not ask me to lie to him. He was past that, and what he said was, "Don't let them take it on the transport, Doc. Whatever it is, don't let them put it in a box." And then he was gone, and I never got to ask him what he meant by that. Why a dying man would spend his last words on the enemy's child, and I have built 100 answers for it in the years since, and not one of them holds the weight he put on it. We held the yard. Barely. By nightfall the Vahn had pulled back to the tree line the way they always did, all at once, on some signal we couldn't see, and the line was a third of what it had been at dawn, and the cut was full of the dying and the dead, and Halloran came to find me in the middle of it with his uniform black to the elbows. He did not mention the transport. There wasn't going to be a transport. There wasn't going to be much of anything. But he looked at the animal in the corner of my station, at its steady amber light, and then he looked at the rows of men it had watched me fail to save, and something in his tired face closed like a door. "You're done, Voss," he said. "Hand over your kit. You're confined to quarters pending a board. Diversion of medical materiel to a combatant species. Refusal of a lawful order. Conduct prejudicial." He recited it like a man reading a sentence off a wall. "I can't have a medic on this line who will stand in a door over one of them while my men bleed in the yard. I can't. You know I can't." "I know," I said, "because I did." He was not wrong. That is the part nobody who hears this story ever wants to sit with, the part I have had to sit with every night since. He was not wrong, and neither was I, and there is no version of that math that comes out even. They took my kit. They took my credentials, the little hard chit that said I was permitted to put my hands inside another living thing and try to keep it in the world. They walked me to a storage container at the back of the yard that they used as a brig, and they put me in it. And because nobody had any idea what else to do with the animal, and because the man who'd have ordered it killed was busy holding what was left of his line, they put the animal in with me. Just shoved the crate in after me and bolted the door. I think the corporal who did it thought it was a kind of mercy, or a kind of joke, or maybe just the path of least resistance for a man who'd had a very bad day. I have never found out. He was dead within the week, like most of them. So that is where I was, the night I lost my job. Sitting on the cold steel floor of a shipping container in the dark, discharged, disgraced, with the rain starting up again on the roof, and an alien predator the size of a hunting dog lying with its spine pressed against my leg, its throat glowing low and steady, the only warm light in the whole black box of that night. It did not sleep. I know because I did not sleep either, and every time I shifted the amber seam would brighten a notch, tracking me, and then settle again when I went still. I sat in that dark and I did the math a person does on the worst night of their life. I had no kit. I had no rank, no credentials, no line, no Acaffer. I had given all of it away over a thing that, by every sane measure available to me, was the enemy, was the very kind of thing that had opened Acaffer under the arm and closed the dark over 40 men at the second wire. I tried to make myself sorry. I want to be truthful about that too. I sat in the cold and I tried, the way you press on a tooth to see if it still hurts, to find the place in me that regretted it, the place that would have handed the crate to Halloran's people and kept my kit and my place on the line and my one small ability to keep doing the only work I knew how to do. I pressed on it for a long time. It was not there. There was nothing there to find. I had reached into the dark and pulled a thing back out, and a person who can do that cannot, it turns out, also be a person who would have left it in the box. And you do not get to keep both of those people. And I had chosen, without ever feeling that I was choosing, the one I could live inside. At some point in the small hours, I put my hand on it the way you put your hand on a dog, without thinking, just for the animal comfort of a warm living thing in the dark, and it went very still under my palm, and then the three-note clicking started up again, low in its chest, and I felt it more than heard it, a vibration running up my arm and into my own chest, and I understood with no evidence at all and complete certainty that it was the sound of Vahn made when it was not afraid. I will tell you the thing I learned in that container because it is the center of everything and I have never told it plain. The Vahn do not tend their wounded. We knew that already in the abstract from the field, from the way a damaged one would be left where it dropped while the pack flowed on. What I learned, sitting in the dark with my hand on that animal, was what it meant. It did not mean they were cruel. It meant they had no concept of it. A Vahn that could not keep up with the pack was already, in every way that mattered to a Vahn, gone, and the pack did not mourn it because there was nothing left to mourn. The thing that had been Vahn about it had ended the moment it fell. They did not abandon their wounded. In their understanding there were no wounded. There were the pack and there was the dark, and a body that had stopped being pack was just more dark. And here was this one, fallen, punctured, left for dead in the wreck of a skiff by everything it had ever known exactly as its nature required. By every law the Vahn lived under it had ended. It was dark in both meanings, the meaning we used and the meaning they used. And a human had reached into the dark and pulled it back out. There was no category for that. Not in 11 years of human medicine, and not in however many thousand years the Vahn had been hunting under their lights. I had done a thing that from where the Vahn stood was not possible. I had unended one of them. And the animal lying against my leg in that container had spent its whole short life inside one law, the law that said the fallen are gone, and that law had broken over it, and it had no idea what it was now, and neither did I. In the gray of the morning, I heard the light start. You learn the sound of it on the line, or rather you learn the absence of sound, because the throat lights make no noise at all, and what you learn to feel instead is the silence of men who have seen the tree line begin to glow. I heard that silence come over the yard. I heard the running, and the shouted orders, and then I heard them stop. The orders just stop, in a way that orders do not stop unless something has happened that is larger than orders. And I got up off the floor of that container, and I put my eye to the gap at the edge of the door, and I looked out at the yard, and I saw what had come. The whole tree line was alight, not the scattered flaring of a raid. A solid wall of amber, hundreds of them, more than I had ever seen, more than I think had ever been seen on that line at once, standing at the third wire in absolute stillness, their lights burning steady and low, and not one of them moving forward. They had us. That was the thing that took a moment to understand. With those numbers, in the state the line was in, they could have come over the wire and ended every human on Vahn by midday and lost almost nothing doing it. The men in the yard understood it. I watched them understand it, watched the fight go out of their shoulders, watched a young soldier near my container quietly set down his weapon because there was no point to it. You do not raise a rifle against the sea. And the Vahn did not come. They stood at the wire and they waited, and after a while one of them came forward alone. It was the largest Vahn I have ever seen before or since. Old. Its hide had gone nearly white with age, and its movements had the terrible unhurried economy of a thing that has never once in its life needed to hurry, and the seam of its throat did not flicker or pulse like the others. It burned. A deep, constant furnace amber, brighter than any of the hundreds behind it, and where it walked the men fell back without being told, the way you fall back from a fire. It came across the broken yard, picking its way between the bodies we had not yet buried, and it did not so much as glance at them. It came toward the container at the back. It came toward me. And the animal at my feet stood up. It had been quiet all night, weak still, favoring the side I'd splinted. But when that old one's light came across the yard, the young one rose, and it pressed itself to the gap at the bottom of the door, and the seam of its throat lit and answered 3 notes, the clicking I had felt against my chest in the dark. And from across the yard, the old one answered back, and the 2 lights spoke to each other through the steel and the rain in a language I could not read and did not need to. The bolt was not mine to draw. From outside, a hand drew it. I never saw whose. The door swung open and the gray morning came in, and the young Vahn went out, limping, into the yard and crossed the open ground between me and the old one, and I stood in the doorway of that container the way I had stood in the doorway of my aid station, because apparently that is the only posture I know, and I watched the enemy's child walk back to the enemy across a field of my own dead. The old one lowered its great white head and put the wedge of its skull against the young one's flank, against the side I had cut into and packed and splinted with a ration tin lid, and held it there, reading it. I understood that somehow. It was reading the wound. It was reading the splint, the packing, the careful, crude human work of it, the unending. And then it raised its head and it looked at me. I have been looked at by a great many things in my life that wanted me dead. I knew that look, and this was not it. There was no name for what this was. It looked at me the way I imagine a man looks at the sea when the sea, against all sense, hands his drowned child back up onto the sand still breathing. It looked at me as at a thing that had done something the world did not permit, and was therefore itself no longer a thing the world had a category for. I had unended one of its own, and in the doing I had unended myself in its eyes, become a kind of creature the Vahn had never met and did not have a law for, and the not having was the whole of it. You cannot prey on what you cannot place. You cannot grind down a line held by things that do, on occasion, reach into the dark and pull the fallen back. The old one held my eyes for a long moment. The seam of its throat dimmed slowly from furnace to ember. A thing I came to understand much later was the nearest the Vahn have to lowering a weapon. Then it turned, and the young one turned with it, and the whole vast wall of amber at the tree line began to go dark in sections, rank by rank, folding back into the trees, until the morning was just the morning again, gray and wet and quiet, and the third wire stood empty. They did not come back to the Sellet line. Not that week, not that season, not in the 2 years I have since heard reported from a line I am no longer permitted to stand on. The killing did not stop everywhere. I want to be careful not to make this more than it was. The war went on other worlds, under other lights, and men I will never meet are dying in it as I tell you this. But on that line, on Vahn, at the cut, the throat lights went out of the tree line and they stayed out, and the men who held that ground after me held it in a quiet they could not explain and were afraid to question, and the official record says the Vahn withdrew from the Sellet sector for reasons unknown. I was discharged. That part stood. There was no board in the end because the line had bigger problems than one medic, but the discharge stood, the diversion of materiel and the refusal of a lawful order, and they put me on a transport to the rear and out, and the chit that said I could put my hands inside a living thing and try to keep it in the world was never given back. I do not fight it. Halloran was not wrong. He held a line over the bodies of his men, and I stood in a door over one of theirs, and the math of that does not come out even, and it is not supposed to. Some things you do because they cost you. That is what makes them the things you do. They never figured out the lights. Research closed the file. The thing Halloran believed might end the war, the weapon in the throat, the dark made just dark again. It never came because nobody ever got a live Vahn into a cold store. Because once, on one wet morning on one losing line, a medic stood in a doorway and would not let them put the patient in a box. Akaffer knew. I think he knew before any of us, with the last clear sight that dying sometimes gives a man. Don't let them put it in a box. I have his daughter's drawing now. They sent me his effects by mistake along with mine, the yellow sun and the careful block letters, and I never sent it on, which is a thing I will answer for somewhere, and I keep it where I used to keep my credentials, in the breast pocket over the heart, and most days that trade feels like the only honest one I ever made. People ask me when they hear a piece of this, whether the animal knew, whether it understood what I had done, whether the old one did, whether any of it was gratitude or recognition, or just the blind machinery of an alien mind doing alien things for reasons that had nothing to do with me. And I tell them the truth, which is that I do not know, and that it does not matter, and that those are two separate statements and both are true. I did not pull that thing out of the dark to be thanked. I pulled it out because it could not breathe and I knew how to make it breathe, and the distance between those two facts was the only distance I have ever found impossible to leave alone, and I would do it again, on that table in that rain, with the line going under and Akafar's blood not yet dry on my hands. I would do it exactly the same. That is not pride. It is closer to the opposite. It is just the only thing I have ever known how to be, and it cost me everything I was, and it bent a war, and I cannot tell you which of those three things is the largest because they are all the same size. There is a light I see sometimes on the worst nights when the rain comes down and smells of iron and the dark presses on the windows. A low amber steady, the color of a coal stirred under ash. I do not know if it is a thing I remember or a thing I have made. I put my hand out toward it in the dark and there is never anything there to touch. But the dark for a moment is warm and it has a shape and it knows me. And I sit with it until the gray comes up, the way I sat with it once before, and I do not turn on the light, because some kinds of dark you do not want made just dark again. Some kinds of dark you reach into. That is the whole of what I learned and the line held and the rest of it I carry.